come. We are 4 people to present. The first one will be Michaela. The second is Alfredo. The third one is Gireesh. And the fourth is Vera O'Riordan. We have 20 minutes in the presentation and 5 minutes to make questions. And 5 minutes before the 25 minutes, I will send you a message to advise that in the 5 minutes before the final, I will send you a message to take into account that only there is 5 minutes. Okay. The first one is Michaela, please. I give you the floor and good luck. And the rest of the people can make the annotation, can make the question at the end of your session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramos. Let me share my screen. There you go. I hope you can all see my screen. Good evening, and thank you very much for being here in this session tonight. I will be presenting our preliminary results for the paper, The Relevance of Life Cycle CO2 Emissions for Vehicle Purchase Decisions, which is still a work in progress. I will start with some background information and more specifically with the motivation behind the paper. It is common knowledge that passenger car transportation is a major contributor of harmful emissions. Because of these concerning numbers, the European Commission adopted a low-emission mobility strategy in July 2016 to support Europe's transition towards a low-carbon economy. One of the main elements of the strategy is to remove obstacles that are hindering the electrification of transport. It is clear that one such obstacle is the acceptance of electric vehicles among private consumers. Although the share of electric vehicles has increased in the last couple of years, the increase has been very low compared to conventional vehicles. Here you can see that electric vehicles merely represent 10.5% of the market share of newly registered passenger vehicles in the European Union. And thus, our goal is to further examine possible barriers causing the low adoption rate of electric vehicles. According to literature, the main barriers for the mass adoption of electric vehicles are the driving range, the charging problem, meaning the availability of charging infrastructure and the long amount of time it takes to fully charge an electric vehicle, and the high purchase price. Furthermore, research shows that consumers do have a strong preference for emission reductions in passenger car transport and also a willingness to pay for low emission vehicles. However, studies also indicate that it is equally important to consider demographic and psychological factors when analyzing consumers' stated preference for low emission vehicles. They have found that the effect of emission performance varies across the population. So the group most likely to adopt fuel vehicles is comprised of mostly young, well-educated, environmentally aware consumers. Yet these studies only consider vehicle emissions caused while the car is in use. A vehicle attribute which has been neglected so far is the influence of a vehicle's production emissions. Hence, our contribution to this type of literature is that we want to investigate whether the CO2 emissions caused during vehicle production maybe also act as a barrier. So we build our hypotheses as follows. We assume a kind of parallel between life cycle costs and life cycle emissions of electric vehicles. We know from, for instance, Dumotier et al., that when consumers are presented with the purchase price and the operating costs of a vehicle, they recognize that the initial high price of electric vehicles can be balanced by the low operating costs of such cars, or even yield net savings in the long run. Such life cycle information thus increases their preference for electric vehicles. Our study transfers this concept onto life cycle emissions of vehicles. So similar to the high purchase price of electric vehicles, emissions caused during the production of such vehicles are also much higher compared to conventional vehicles. However, just like the low operational costs balance the high purchase costs or even yield savings in the long run, the low emissions caused during the use of electric vehicles also allow for substantial life cycle emission reductions compared to conventional vehicles, especially if electric vehicles are charged with renewable energy. And we also know from past literature that people are willing to pay for emission reductions in vehicle use. Thus, we hypothesize that high production emissions may also act as barrier for the diffusion of electric vehicles, and that respondents thus have a positive willingness to pay for emission reductions caused during vehicle production. And since we also know from past literature that environmental awareness positively influences the preference for electric vehicles, our second hypothesis is that respondents with a higher level of environmental awareness are more sensitive towards vehicle production emissions. And lastly, we compare the effects of vehicle production emissions with emissions caused during vehicle use. To quickly summarize, the key goal of our study is to elicit respondents' preferences for low emission vehicles and specifically their preferences and willingness to pay valuation for emission reductions in vehicle production. So let's have a look at the data and the variables of our analysis. The basis of our study is a stated choice experiment regarding vehicle choice, which was embedded in a large-scale computer-based survey among over 1,100 German households. The survey was carried out by the German market research company Psuma between April and May this year, and the sample was stratified according to the German population. We used the stated preference approach, meaning the choice situations were all hypothetical, and each respondent was presented with 6 choice sets in which he or she had to choose between 4 hypothetical vehicles, namely conventional vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, extended range electric vehicles, and purely electric vehicles. Looking at the design of the choice experiment, the vehicles were each characterized by the following 8 alternative specific attributes, for which the different levels are all based on past vehicle choice literature. And our attribute of main interest was the total CO2 emissions from production. In order to keep the hypothetical vehicle alternatives as realistic as possible, some alternatives were customized or grounded to reality according to respondents' indications made in the survey questions about the vehicle he or she would consider buying. Here you can see an example choice set of those presented to the respondents. As you can see, the design of the experiment was labeled, meaning instead of choosing between simply vehicle 1, 2, 3, and 4, the respondents always chose between 1 conventional vehicle, 1 plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, 1 extended range electric vehicle, and 1 purely electric vehicle. And finally, the data was analyzed with flexible mixed logit models using Stata. So in order to run the mixed logit model estimation to analyze the observed choices, several variables had to be specified. The dependent variable in our case is the choice among the 4 hypothetical types of vehicles. Furthermore, the 8 attributes of the choice experiment presented before act as basis for the explanatory variables. And 3 of our 4 vehicle types were also included as alternative specific constants so that we could estimate the initial preferences, with conventional vehicle as the base category. Next, we include some individual characteristics. However, because we use a mixed logit model, we can only include the individual characteristics as interaction variables with our vehicle attributes. The key individual characteristic for our analysis is the well-known new ecological paradigm scale by Dunlap et al. As a measure of respondents' environmental awareness or values. We then control for respondents' political orientation, since environmental values have been shown to strongly correlate with political values. And lastly, we also control for the socio-demographic characteristics, gender, age, and education. So let's have a look at our results. As you can see, all alternative specific attributes, except the time it takes to refuel vehicles with an internal combustion engine, have a significant impact in the expected direction. So purchase price and fuel costs, CO2 emissions in use and in production, as well as charging time, have a significant negative effect on vehicle choice, while an increase in vehicle range has a positive effect on vehicle choice. Meaning the effect of CO2 emissions caused during vehicle production is in line with our first hypothesis that individuals do have a preference for a reduction of vehicle production emissions. Also in line with literature, but astounding that this hasn't changed in recent years, is the significant preference for conventional vehicles over electric vehicles. The willingness to pay for conventional vehicles over electric vehicles is extremely high, with the value of more than 18,000 euro. While this value is almost half of that, namely 8,500 when it comes to plug-in hybrids, it is very high nonetheless, especially when considering the policy measures in place to promote electric vehicles in Germany. Now let's have a look at the willingness to pay for the two kinds of emission reductions. So the willingness to pay for emission reductions in vehicle productions is around 300 euros per ton, and almost half of that for reductions in vehicle use, with the willingness to pay of 160 euros per ton. To put this into perspective, the CO2 emissions caused in vehicle production can range between 5 and 16 tons, according to vehicle class and type. So these amounts may seem high, however, the amount for emission reductions in use is in line with existing literature. Thus, we assume that our values are correct, even though they may be a little overestimated due to the hypothetical bias. But overall, we can assume that they go into the right direction, thus giving us an indication about our third hypothesis, that individuals are willing to pay more for emission reductions in productions compared to emission reductions in use. Next, the highly significant standard deviation for the alternative specific constants and attributes suggests that a large degree of heterogeneity exists in preferences among the respondents. We thus extend our model. These are the results of the extended model. However, I will zoom into the most important results in a minute. We extend the model in order to gain a better understanding of the diverse preferences among the respondents by adding interaction variables between the individual characteristics and 5 of our alternative specific attributes, namely 3 of the 4 dummy variables for the vehicle types, as well as the attributes emissions caused in vehicle production and vehicle use. According to these results, environmentally aware people almost exclusively show a preference for electric vehicles. However, the determinant for this is much rather ecologically oriented political views than the respondents' level of environmental values, which is not surprising since research has shown that the NEP score, which is our measure for environmental values, and the political values are highly correlated. We also found evidence for this correlation when omitting the variables for political values from our model. Yet, environmental awareness does not seem to have an effect on the preference for vehicle emission reductions, whether in vehicle use or in vehicle production, and regardless of including or omitting the variables for political values. Meaning an additional reduction in emissions seems to play a secondary role to the vehicle type choice to environmentally conscious people. Furthermore, we also see some effects of socio-demographics on vehicle choice, however not on the preference for emission reductions. According to our results, females have a significant preference for conventional vehicles over electric vehicles compared to males. And an increase in age leads to a significant decrease for choosing electric vehicles, or mostly range extender electric vehicles. And lastly, if omitting the political value variables, we also see a significant positive effect of having a high education on the probability of choosing electric vehicles. So in conclusion, we can say that on the one hand, German individuals are willing to pay to reduce CO2 emissions caused by vehicle productions, and the willingness to pay for emission reductions caused during the use of vehicles is about half of that amount. On the other hand, though, it seems like environmentally aware individuals are not more sensitive towards CO2 emissions. However, they do show a significantly positive preference for electric vehicles compared to conventional vehicles. So what are the implications of such results? The significant willingness to pay for emission reductions in vehicle use and productions suggests that vehicle life cycle emissions should definitely be made more salient to consumers. However, the primary determinant for electric vehicle choice seems to be an ecological political orientation. This provides evidence that vehicle choice is very much influenced by political discussions and orientation rather than specific vehicle attributes. And at this point, in order to achieve a higher market penetration of electric vehicles, subsidies for such vehicles should at least start at 8,500 euros, since German citizens in general still prefer conventional vehicles over electric vehicles. However, as you can see, this is not in line with the current environmental premium electric vehicle purchasers receive in Germany at the moment, especially when it comes to purely electric vehicles. But as these are still our preliminary results, we do plan on running more models in order to investigate reasons behind the large discrepancy between the willingness to pay and the premium for electric vehicles, mostly purely electric vehicles. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hear your questions, also your feedback.
Thank you very much, Michaela, for your wonderful presentation. Very clear, and you have been on time. We have 5 to 7 minutes to ask questions. Please, if any people can make any question, you are welcome. Any question, please?
Hello?
Hello, Joachim.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello, Joachim Schleich here. Hello, Michaela. Thank you for really intriguing analysis and very interesting findings, especially on the willingness to pay for electric vehicles. Since you're focusing on the willingness to pay, that seems to be your main interest. Have you considered estimating the model in willingness to pay space to provide maybe methodologically more sound estimates of the willingness to pay for these vehicles, or is this something you're intending to do as a next step?
Definitely, we have, because we've only had the data for such a short time, we only received it a couple of weeks ago. We haven't had the time to really run all the models we plan on, but we definitely also, with the results, considered to still run the models in the willingness to pay space, and then also maybe even calculate the individual willingness to pay to see whether the high willingness to pay for purely electric vehicles may be distributed among certain groups of people as well. So that's definitely on our list to do in the future.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, sure.
I mean, it is surprising, as you mentioned, that now that electric vehicles have diffused quite a bit in Germany, particularly thanks to the high subsidies in recent years, very recently. Do you have a variable in your survey which would give you some information to which extent the participants in the survey had experience or with electric vehicles that you could then include in your analysis?
I don't think we have one that specifically asks for electric vehicle experience, but we do have, well, I'm actually not completely sure, because we have so many questions about people's, which car they drive, whether they plan on driving, on buying a car in the future. And we also have questions in line with electric vehicles, whether they know the whole paying system and whether they know if there's a charging station in their area. But I am not 100% sure whether there's a specific question about the experience. That would be interesting, definitely interesting to consider though. So that's something we would definitely look up, and then maybe even include still if we do have a question in line with that information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Any other question? Does anybody want to ask? Okay, I have two questions. The first one is, what is the role? You have seen that there is a strong against, a strong with the conventional car. People prefer the conventional car, and I would like to know your opinion. What is the role of the infrastructure charge? Maybe people is against the electricity car because there is no, in Europe, maybe in Spain, you have not the confidence that you will have a place to charge your car when you go on holidays and something like that, or to work. Maybe there is not the infrastructure. What is the role of that in the preference of the consumer?
Yes, so it's unfortunately something that we don't really consider in our experiment. However, we do know from past literature that charging infrastructure is definitely one of the most important barriers for the diffusion of electric vehicles. And I actually also went to a session this morning where Mr. Kai Rommel also actually had a presentation on where they were investigating this problem much more specifically. And it definitely still is a problem, especially in Germany, that the infrastructure isn't well enough equipped yet for people. I think if the diffusion of electric vehicles does increase, then people should definitely also, or policy should definitely also concentrate on maximizing the charging infrastructure. That's definitely one of the big barriers for the diffusion as well. Okay,
one second question very quickly. The result of when you use contingent valuation methods, the results in the literature is similar from choice experiment or are very different? What do you think about? There is a convergence in the results or are very different when you use the different methodologies?
As far as I can look back now, the results seem to be very similar. I have to admit that I mostly compared it with other mixed logit results, but the main results all go into the same directions. So the direction of preferences is the same for most of the literature that I've that also handles vehicle choice. So they are very similar, but the specifically willingness to pay, I would have to look into the literature again to make sure that it definitely goes into the same direction.
Okay, thank you very much, Michaela. Congratulations. And I give the floor to Alfredo.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm going to share my screen. everything is okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Alfredo Ramírez. I'm a researcher at the Department of Computer Science and System Engineering in the University of La Laguna in Spain. Today, I'm going to present our recent work entitled Fuel Life Cycle Analysis for Different Types of Vehicles in the Canary Islands, with collaboration with Professor Ramos in the chair today, and Josue Barrera Santana. And of course, thank you very much to the conference organization for allowing us to participate in this conference. Energy transition, it's one of the key or the biggest challenge that the human is going to fight in the future, in the near future. Of course, climate change and environmental challenge requires an urgent and ambitious response from all the countries all over the world. Renewable energies and energy storage are the game changers in this transition, of, mainly in the electricity sector, and the electrification of all kind of consumption. It's very important in order to transform our consumption to electric and give the renewable sources more protagonism in the generation, and of course the land transportation with electric cars. It's one of the biggest challenge to develop in the next years. European countries lead this transformation, and it's committed to achieve the full decarbonization in 2050. At national level in Spain, recently they have published a new law 7/2021 about climate change and energy transition, and from this law it's derived the National Integrated Energy and Climate Plan for 2021-2030. And in the Canary Islands, that this is the case of a study, new plans are going to develop for the next year in order to decarbonize the archipelago in 2040. But the current energy context in Canary Island is very far from the decarbonization. Today, 97% of the primary energy sources came from oil-derived fuels. The 40% of total emissions are from transport, and the electricity sector only represents the 20% of final energy consumption. We are situated, the Canary Islands are situated far from the European continent, 1,500 kilometers far, and near the African coast. They are composed by 7 islands, in which Tenerife and Gran Canaria are the biggest one. The Canary Island is the biggest outermost region in the European country and the most GDP from these regions. And the 7 islands are not connected, except Lanzarote and Fuerteventura, that are electrically connected by submarine cable. And in order to give an idea about renewable penetration in the electricity mixes in different islands, around 18% of total energy produced by electricity comes from renewable sources. The rest, the conventional, it's produced by oil-derived fuels from fuel oil and gas oil, burning on combined cycles, diesel engines, or steam turbines, for example. And here is the question. If we charge with this mix, the electric vehicle is greener or not? This is a big question. and we try to respond in this presentation. The objective of this study is to evaluate different light-duty vehicles, power and train technologies in the terms of energy consumption and greenhouse gases emissions from the well to the wheels in the Canary Island context. We are going to use a life cycle analysis, specifically a well-to-wheel methodology that is very commonly used in the literature of land transportation, in order to or in order to calculate the emissions and the energy consumption from the well extraction of the fuels in other countries to the wheels, the consumption and emission to move the vehicle. And if we review a little bit the literature, we can highlight that, for example, Hawking and all say that it is counterproductive to promote electric vehicles in areas where the electricity is primarily produced by coal or oil. Sivak and Schutel said that countries such as China, USA, India, or other African countries that use oil or coal as major sources is counterproductive to use electric cars, because the indirect emissions are higher than conventional. And for example, in the Joint Research Center report in 2020 about well-to-wheels, they say that the electric proportions is very efficient, and in overall the use of energy is very low, but it critically depends on the electricity mix that the electric cars are connected. Here in Canary Island, the methodology is going to be in this way, in this work. First, we have the internal combustion engine cars. We have several processes from the well to the tank of the gas station, refueling station, and then we observe the part of the tank to the wheels of the vehicle. And the electric car is the same, but we are going to add the part of the electricity sector, because we import the fuel oil and gas oil that burns in our electric power plants, conventional power plants, for produce electricity and then charge the cars. And it implies a less efficiency that charge directly from renewables, for example. But this part, it's only the 80%, depends of the system. And for the results, we are going to present the results in two terms: energy consumption in megajoules per 100 kilometers, and greenhouse gases emissions in grams of CO2 equivalents per kilometer. And by technology, we are going to analyze different powertrain technologies, for example, internal combustion engine gasoline, diesels with liquefied petroleum gas, hybrid vehicles, both mild hybrids with and fuel hybrid electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric cars, and battery electric cars. And we are going to analyze different car segments: small cars, segment A; compact cars, subcompacts, segment B and C; large cars, familiar cars, segment D and E; segment G, it's SUV cars, big cars, large cars; and M segment, that it's multi-purpose cars. And for the plug-in electric cars, we are going to analyze different scenarios. At present scenario with the electricity mix from today, 2020, and future scenarios, midterm scenarios with the objectives of 2030. It's 70% renewable, for example. In different islands, for example, charge your electric car in Tenerife will be different than charge your electric car in La Gomera, because the electricity mix are very different. Here are the pathways of the fuel that is imported from different countries. The major producer imported is Nigeria, with 15% of the mix of oil. Then Mexico, Kazakhstan, Arabia Saudi, USA, Iraq, and Brazil, and other ones. From each country, we are going to transport this oil to the Spanish refineries. In the Spanish refinery, we are going to refine the crude to convert in different fuels. In this work, we are going to analyze the fuel oil and gas oil to transport to electric power plants. And in the other path, we are going to analyze the gasoline, the diesel, and the liquefied petroleum gas in order to feed the conventional cars. And for example, for the electricity sector, we consider 4 kinds of electric power plants: combined cycles, burning gas oil, gas turbine, burning gas oils, diesel engine, and steam turbines burning gas oil, fuel oil. Then we transport the electricity through the grid. And finally, we charge our car in the electric power supply. And finally, we consume the energy inside the vehicle. In the internal combustion engine vehicle, we consume the energy in these engines, and in the electric cars through electric motor. Here is the modeling. For energy consumption, we have to take in account all the process explaining before. And for the greenhouse gases emission, we have to take in account the different emission focus through the process. For example, in electric cars, we have not direct emission in the car, in the cities, but we have indirect emissions through all the path. To do this, we have collected all newly light-duty vehicles registered in the Canary Island, collected from 2019 and 2020. It's more. It's about, our database is about 47,000 cars, new registrations, and we have performed a large data mining work in order to collect all the registrations and classified by brand, model, power, variant, segments, type of fuels, and type of powertrains. It has a very difficult data mining collection. And then we add the technical data that it's not included in our database. We have added the WLP cycle, homologation cycle, that it's recently
Alfredo, 5 minutes.
Okay, it's recently added in the European countries, and we have a different type of consumption: low, medium, high, and very extra performance cycles, and in 5 different segment groups, as we talked before. If we saw here the results of this part, this consumption part, and the share of different technologies and powertrains, we have to highlight that SUV, it's more or less the 55% of the total sample. We have a big problem in Canary Island with big cars, because it is a fashion to buy a car since 2015, a big car. And for example, in average emissions, we have to say that our average is in 129 grams per kilometer. And for example, average in Spain is 121 only. We have over the average. If we saw the results by scenarios, 2020 scenarios in Canary Island, we have to say that gasoline seems to be, in average, less pollutant of all internal combustion engine cars. The graph in the figure above, it's the energy consumption, and the figure below is greenhouse gases emission. LPG, it's a good solution in big segments. We can reduce the emission with LPG in big segments of cars. Mild hybridization just only reduced 3% of, in average, the greenhouse gases emission. And full hybridization, it seems to be a good solution to reduce in a big way the emission in internal combustion engine cars. But in case of electric cars and plug-in hybrid electric cars, the situation is very different. For example, plug-in hybrid electric cars are not recommended because in average, with very poor renewable sources in the electricity mix, the energy consumption and the emission, direct emission and indirect emission are very high. For example, in the case of La Gomera, in the island of La Gomera, it's the worst case in the study. But in the case of electric cars, the situation is better. We can reduce both energy consumption and greenhouse gases emission in comparison with internal combustion engines in all the systems. And in the case of El Hierro, the smaller island, with a 50% of renewable sources in the electricity mix, it is very good to buy an electric car. For future scenarios, we can highlight that plug-in hybrid electric vehicles start to be a good solution, and electric cars are very low, nearly 73% less pollutant than internal combustion engine cars. Respect the policy's implication, as other countries, we label the cars. Here there are 4 labels: 0 label, eco label, and C label. And B label it's only for all cars. And if we saw this graph, this bubble graph, the big bubbles are internal combustion gasoline cars, green in gray. They are situated near here, but LGP with eco label, that it's better in terms of aids, governing aids, and less restrictions. There are a little bit more energy consumption from the internal combustion engine in average. Hybrids are in a good position of emissions, and plug-in electric cars are situated above the graph, nearly above.
1 minute, Alfredo.
And it's implied that electric cars are good situated. And if we go ahead to 2030 with the electricity mix rich on renewables, we can reduce both emissions and energy consumptions. Finally, we have to highlight that this could be a good example for other island regions in the world. Policies should focus on the specifications of each region. Maybe in Spain mainland, promote the plug-in hybrid electric cars, it's a good idea, but here with electricity mix pouring renewables could be not a good idea. And finally, the rise and popularity of SUV segment becomes a huge problem in the midterm because we could not to reduce the average CO2 emissions in the islands. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. I know it's very hard to resume all this hard work. I know I have seen your work, and I know it's very hard. Any question, please, about this presentation? Nobody wants to ask? Alfredo, then I'm going to ask you some things. What do you think is the reason? Because in Canary Islands, the segment of SUV is increasing. And what would be what should be the policy, the energy policy to change this trend?
Thank you very much for your question, Professor Ramos. This is a good question because generally in the past, here in Canary Island, have a big car or all-road car. It's very important for agriculture or north zones of the island. There are a lot of mountains, and mainly this part of the island users use this type of car. But I think that from the recent year in the past, the automakers promote more these bigger cars, and maybe urban users in the Canary Island they buy these new cars because I don't know, maybe because the sellers prefer to sell these big cars because they have a biggest price, and but we don't know exactly what is this problem. But we are working in a new study, and we are going to try to explain why the users are buying more these cars than other ones. In terms of energy, it's a big problem because these cars consume more. They have a heavy weight. They are not very aerodynamics. They consume more brakes, more tires, and from the point of view of environmental challenge, this is not a good solution. It's more the trend of emissions, the global emission in the Canary Island, is growing because of the buy of these cars and the reduction of the diesel cars. It has a double effect: big cars and no diesel, and this build a bad idea about environmental reduction of greenhouse gas emissions.
And Alfredo, in the short run, for example, one conclusion is that in La Gomera, for example, it's very dirty to use electricity cars. What do you think is the best solution? To install renewables in La Gomera, or the interconnection with Tenerife, and to install more clean energies in the island of Tenerife? What do you think about that?
Yes, the interconnection with Tenerife and La Gomera is projected for 2025. Then when two systems, the smaller La Gomera is connected with the biggest Tenerife, mainly the benefits of renewable penetration in Tenerife could affect to La Gomera. But I think that in La Gomera they should promote the self-consumption photovoltaic systems, maybe with 2 or 3 windmills, and the interconnection with Tenerife, we can we can build a new cleaner or greener electric system in La Gomera in the short term. Nowadays, La Gomera is 100% conventional, and this is why the figures are very, very unfavorable respect the electric cars and the plug-in hybrid electric cars.
Okay, Alfredo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I give the floor to Gireesh, that is going to speak about the Indian case. I don't know the pronunciation. Is Gireesh or?
Yeah. Hi, Paco. My video is not starting for some reason. It says that host has stopped my video, but I will try to share my screen.
Okay.
Because I'm trying to start my video and it's not starting. So maybe the session host could look into this.
Okay, yes.
Okay, now.
Host.
Yes. All right, now there you go. Okay, great. All right, so let me share my screen. All right, so here we are. Yeah, I'm Gireesh Shrimali. I'm a pre-court energy scholar at Stanford University. Before Stanford, I was leading the India work of a think tank called Climate Policy Initiative, and I've also taught in a couple of universities, including in India, in the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad, and at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. So this particular work is on, as you can see, we are looking at the subsidization of electric vehicles in India, and the question is, from the government's perspective, what's the most cost-effective way of subsidizing electric vehicles? So there's an underlying theme here that electric vehicles need to be subsidized to spur their adoption. And I'll talk about what are the reasons, but typically the main reason seems to be that they're more expensive than corresponding ICE or the internal combustion engine vehicles. And we'll start to look into what the Indian government is doing. Are they being cost effective? So just to give you a brief background on India's plans or India's ambitions on what they want to do with electric vehicles, and I'll come at it from a couple of different angles. But this is one way to look at it, and this is a figure from an IAEA report, which says what is India's ambition, and it's comparing it to China's ambition. And you can see that India wants to sell about 10 million electric cars in 2030 itself, which is about 9 years from now, and that seems to somewhat match with China's ambition. So these are pretty ambitious plans, and the key takeaway here is that these plans are significant, and India is likely to be a big electric car market. So getting kind of closer to what India is really trying to do in terms of its nationally determined contributions. There are kind of one main one, and the main one seems to be a renewable energy target, and that's kind of a formal target in the NDC, and that's about 40% of electricity generation capacity by renewable energy by 2030. Now, there's also a more of an informal target. It's not a formal target, and it's pretty well known, and that's the target of 30% of vehicle fleet by electric vehicles by 2030. And this has changed over time. Initially, there was some announcements around 100% of electric vehicles by 2030, but that was changed to 100% of new vehicles by 2030, which kind of somewhat translates to 30% of vehicle fleet by 2030. So now, if you're wanting to get to this kind of adoption and the significant number of vehicles you're trying to sell in the market, essentially in the early days, there are a lot of barriers to electric vehicle adoption, and many of you have talked about these barriers. And I have a list here, and the first barrier seems to be the higher upfront cost or the capital expenditure, and this is despite the fact that the operational expenditure of electric vehicles tends to be lower, and this despite the fact higher capital expenditure remains a barrier, and this is despite the fact that the battery costs are coming down over time. And then there are some other barriers, as been discussed. The model themselves are not as attractive. There are issues around range anxiety and charging stations, etc. And finally, there is this concern around unknown technology, especially it has to do with batteries. So that gets into the financing of electric cars, because financiers are still not comfortable with batteries. What I end up focusing on in this talk is the first barrier, and which is typically why, and that is the key barrier because of which subsidies seem to be given, at least in the Indian market. And one of the first assertions I make is that instead of looking at higher capital expenditure, we need to look at the total cost of ownership, okay, and make subsidy decisions around total cost of ownership. And then a connected component of that is if the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle is comparable or less than the total cost of ownership of an ICE vehicle or the internal combustion engine vehicle, then maybe there are other ways to support adoption of electric vehicles, and subsidies may not be the best way. A little bit more about the policies, the Indian policies, the policies that India has for subsidizing electric vehicles are called FAME policy. It's a short form, and it covers many policy, many vehicles in many different forms. As I said, multiple vehicles are covered. It covers two-wheelers, it covers three-wheelers, four-wheeler cars, and four-wheeler buses. And when I say four-wheeler cars, it's covering individual ownership of cars, but it does not cover taxis or fleets. Similarly, it does not cover four-wheel trucks. Therefore, there's a very focused coverage. And one thing I want to point out that most of the vehicles in India are two-wheelers. So these vehicles need to be looked at as well. Now, the other way to look at this FAME subsidy is that what kind of subsidy is being provided. And these are mostly upfront one-time subsidy also called the capital expenditure or CapEx subsidy. Okay, and there's been two tranches of this policy. And I have provided the numbers in Indian rupees, which is the Indian currency, but essentially to get to dollar numbers, you divide it by around 75. So the FAME 1 policy that came around in 2015, that provided about 100 million in support, and then FAME 2 policy that came in 2019, it's likely to provide around 1 billion of support. And this is the context in which I ask my two questions. One is which vehicle segments should be subsidized? Because if you're subsidizing segments that should not be subsidized, you're not being cost effective. So we want to know which vehicle segments should be subsidized. And then the second question is, if you're subsidizing vehicles, and this is a purely economic analysis, I'm not looking at subsidies being used to overcome other barriers than just cost. Which policy should be used? And the policies that you have in hand are, as I said, the Indian government is using this capital expenditure one-time subsidy, which is called the CapEx policy. It could also use what we call an OpEx policy, which is to subsidize on a per kilometer basis, right? On an operational basis. And many authors have argued that maybe we should use OpEx policies. And the third one is what we call the FinEx, or the financial support policies, where the government or in collaboration with multilateral banks or other institutions, financial institution, could provide an interest subsidy or reduce the cost of capital, especially if these cars are being bought on leases or as on loans. And so the idea is that you want to provide a policy or a subsidy. And again, I'll discuss this a little bit later. The idea is that you want to subsidize so that the user is neutral between buying an EV versus an ICE vehicle. Okay, and neutral from again a cost perspective. And this gives you another kind of view into how detailed FAME is, right? And this is just for the two-wheeler categories. You can see that for every kind of vehicle, they've tried to figure out how much of a subsidy that would be given. It depends on the size of the battery. It depends on the kind of vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a huge variation, and there's a lot of analysis that has been done to provide these subsidies. All right. So now coming to the methods that I use and the data that I use to answer these questions. And as I had mentioned earlier, the idea is to focus on cost and do a purely economic analysis. And you can, the idea is to provide subsidies so that the user or the consumer is neutral between buying an electric vehicle compared to an equivalent ICE vehicle. And, if you're doing a purely financial analysis, many metrics can be used in the process. You could use the upfront cost comparison, which is what a lot of users use. But our assertion is, or my assertion is, that you need to do this analysis based on total cost of ownership. And the total cost of ownership means you need to look at lifetime costs. And if you're looking at lifetime costs, again, you can start looking at different metrics. And these are all metrics that come from finance. You could look at a payback, which says how quickly an electric vehicle pays back for itself compared to an ICE vehicle. And this is based on the assumption that the operating cost of running an electric vehicle is lower than an ICE vehicle, which generally seems to be true. You can also use the internal rate of return metric, which has to do with, if you're looking at these vehicles as investments, what is your internal rate of return? What I end up using, and which is the most common metric, is using the net present value, which is the discounted cost over the lifetime of the electric vehicle. And I also use what we call the total cost of ownership, or a TCO, which has to do with you're looking at the net present value of the total discounted cost, but you're looking at a per kilometer version of that, but it's very similar. So when I'm looking at just the vehicles, and when I'm comparing vehicles to figure out which vehicles need to be subsidized, I look at TCO. On the other hand, when I'm looking at the subsidy and which subsidy should be used, I look at the NPV metric, or the net present value metric. So now, so the methods are pretty straightforward. In many contexts, it is more of a policy paper, and the insights are pretty interesting. And this is on the right hand side. I also have a table of the vehicles that I compared, and the idea was to look at similar vehicles. And the first column is we're looking at different kind of vehicles, and there are various kind of vehicles we looked at. We looked at the typical miles driven per day. We look at what's their lifetime, and then the last two columns is the capital expenditure of internal combustion engine vehicle, ICE vehicle, and the EV in the last column, right? And the idea was that we're looking at very similar vehicles. All right, so with that, we come to the results, and the results. The first result is in the first question: which vehicles should be subsidized, if at all? And the idea was that you need to subsidize if the total cost of ownership of the EV is higher than the total cost of ownership of the ICE vehicle. And if the total cost of ownership of the EV is less, then you don't need to subsidize. And so what you see here is the vehicles are in column 1. The total cost of ownership is in Indian rupees per kilometer for the ICE vehicle versus the electric vehicle. And then the fourth column is essentially a ratio of the total cost of ownership of the electric vehicle to the total cost of ownership of the ICE vehicle. And then the fourth column just says, do you need subsidy, based on the criteria that I just highlighted. So you can see that if the fourth column, which is the percentage, if that is higher than 100%, then you need subsidy. And through this analysis, what I find is that the bolded items, right, the four-wheel cars, which is the personal cars, you need subsidy for that, as well as for the four-wheel trucks, you need subsidy for that. And by the way, these trucks are long-haul trucks. Whereas for all of the categories, the two-wheelers, three-wheelers, the four-wheeler fleets, or even four-wheeler buses, the the total cost of ownership for EVs is less, already less than the total cost of ownership of ICE vehicles. So the subsidy is not required. Okay, and this is where the divergence from the actual FAME policy is pretty clear, because, and I'll talk about this in a second, and then a couple of slides as to where the differences are. The second result is on subsidies themselves. So
5 minutes. It is 5 minutes, please.
Yes, yes. Now I'll talk about the subsidies themselves. As I've established that only two cars or two kind of vehicle categories need subsidies, which is the four-wheel cars and four-wheel trucks. For those two, I try to figure out, if the government is subsidizing, how much is it costing the government? And again, the question, if you recall, is what's the cheapest way to subsidize? Okay, so the idea is that the subsidy is given so that the customer is neutral between the EV and the ICE vehicle, and then you essentially figure out what is the net present value of that subsidy over the lifetime of the vehicle is. And what you see in the top table, that the capital subsidy is the cheapest. And what I've shown is that it's essentially the capital subsidy as a percentage of capital expenditure, or the initial capital expenditure. You can see that the capital expenditure is the cheapest, which is what I bolded in the top table. But I've also provided the other two subsidies. And that's one key takeaway. And the other key takeaway is that these subsidies are still pretty significant. I mean, from 1/3 to 1/2 of the total capital expenditure. All right. So moving on to a little bit of discussion on first is FAME, the policy, doing the right thing? Is it being cost effective? And on the first question, is it subsidizing vehicles that need to be subsidized, or is it subsidizing vehicles that don't need to be subsidized? And what I've shown here is that, at least from my simple analysis based on purely cost, on the total cost of ownership, many of the vehicles that the policy is subsidizing don't need to be subsidized at all. And these are the two-wheelers and the three-wheelers and the four-wheel buses. They don't need to be subsidized, and they're being subsidized. So that means the current policy, or the policy that the way they're working, are not cost effective from that perspective. Whereas on the other hand, the policy is not subsidizing certain vehicles that need subsidies. Okay, and so it's kind of confusing as to how these subsidies were picked, and at least from a cost effectiveness perspective, the policy is not cost effective. And to me, it seems like that the policies have been picked to pretty much address the upfront cost issue. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. On the second question, which subsidy is more cost effective? As I found out, and through my simple analysis, that the capital subsidy is the most cost effective, and that's what the Indian government is doing. So that's reasonable from a choice of subsidy perspective. Now, coming to my last slide, and this is a very, very interesting discussion point, and this is something that could be used as a launching pad for future research in this area. Many cars, as I said, do not require subsidy based on a TCO comparison. And despite the fact the Indian government, many other governments continue to subsidize these electric vehicles because the upfront cost is higher. But we know that the total cost of ownership is lower, but it's somehow not working out for the consumer. The consumer still seems to be focused on the upfront cost and seems to care less about the operating costs. And this is typically how consumers make decisions. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm sure within this group there are many interesting thoughts on this. But the real question is, if my TCO is lower for a car, even though the upfront expenditure is higher, how do you create structures, business models, financing instruments, or financing interventions that a cheaper TCO EV starts looking interesting to the consumer? And one of the ideas is, and it's an abstract idea in some sense, but you're saying if the total cost of ownership is lower, can you convert those total cost of ownership to annual payments, that are equal annual payments, just like more like an annuity, right? That we use in finance. And then you compare the annuities of the two cars. And if the total cost of ownership is lower, the annuity for the electric vehicles is going to be lower as well. And therefore, it should work out for the consumer. And this is where a lot of innovation is possible from a business model perspective. One of the innovation that's possible is to separate out the battery from the electric car and provide the battery as a separate lease from the actual car itself, and make it kind of more appealing from a cost perspective.
1 minute, please.
Yeah, but I think this is where I am. I hope this last slide is somewhat thought-provoking in terms of what companies can do, what governments could do, and just to wrap up, I would suggest that governments are using their policy resources, the finite money they have, on promoting these kind of business models that I kind of started to talk about in my last slide, as opposed to just focusing on pure subsidies, right? And I think they can get more bang for their buck or more leverage. So I'll stop here and I'll take if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Gireesh. A good presentation, very clear. Does anybody wants to ask to Gireesh? Nobody.
Yes.
Alfredo, okay, thank you.
Yes. I want to ask you some question about maybe a recommendation on suggestions. For example, in the Canary Island, we have two types of supports in the CAPEX for buy electric cars. We have a direct subsidy of 4,500 euros per car in average, and an exemption of taxes in the purchase. The question is that the sellers doping the price of the cars because of they have a good condition, and they put the price a little bit over, for example, in comparison with Spain mainland. In Spanish mainland, they have 21% of taxes. And the difference between the price from Spain mainland and Canary Island, it's not the 21% less. How to avoid this kind of practice with the sellers? Maybe fixing a price of a car, or I don't know. Please give me some recommendations or some ideas about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's price fixing becomes another issue. I mean, I think if the sellers are increasing the prices, is it because the demand is high, right? So obviously, maybe the price could be there could be a kind of policy that says that the car should be sold at the same price in different countries, but I think it's hard to control the price. I think the automakers and the dealers will sell the cars at the price buyers are willing to buy the cars. And you're right that sometimes because of rebates and because of the customer preferences, there may be some price inflation. And we have seen that not only in electric vehicles, but also in rooftop solar. But that's an unintended side effect of policies. But I would not recommend like government fixing prices though.
Any more question, please? More question? Gireesh, one question from the public perspective. Have you internalized the CO2 price of emissions, the price of CO2 emission? If the price of CO2 emissions would be very, very, very high, maybe these conclusions could change, because the cost, if you have internalized the CO2 prices, could influence these results. or not?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you include carbon prices as also one of the cost components, and that's a great question, because I mostly looked at, capital expenditure, which is the upfront cost. I looked at the operating expenditure, which has to do with fuel cost, and I looked at maintenance and insurance and everything else. But if you start including the carbon dioxide price, the electric vehicle will become even more attractive, right? So that makes an even better case for no subsidization if you had carbon prices. But India doesn't have carbon prices right now. Even though there is a carbon price on coal, there is no carbon price on the oil side, on the transportation side, and there's still no talk of a market. So, but even without considering carbon prices, I think the economic analysis says that EVs are already cost competitive, and the best way the government policy can help in diffusing EVs into the market, it's through helping business models and financing of those cars, as opposed to giving pure subsidies.
Okay, thank you very much. We are on time. Now is the last one of the presentations. I give the floor to Vera O'Riordan to ask about the Ireland cases. I think so.
Thank you. Just a minute there now, and I will share my screen here. Screen. Okay. Okay, great stuff. So I hope everyone can see the screen and hear me all right. Let me know if there's any issues. So
yes, it's okay.
I'm going to be great, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about a study that we completed here at MARI, the Marine and Renewable Energy Institute, based at the Environmental Research Institute here in Ireland, where we looked at an ex post analysis of the 2008 car tax change on private vehicle CO2 emissions and tax revenue. And my own name is Vera O'Riordan, and it's great to be here with you today at the IAEE virtual conference. So I suppose first to begin is the context for our analysis. And just like every other country that is committed to the Paris Climate Agreement, Ireland has set about commitments to climate action. And we're going about this as well through our national policy, which is underwritten through our Climate Action Bill, which was passed recently. And we've signed up to a legal obligation to a 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for Ireland by 2030 compared to 2020. And this is about a 7% per year reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we also have our Programme for Government and our Climate Action Plan as policies to underpin those commitments. And transport in Ireland is responsible for about 20% of all our greenhouse gas emissions. So it really is a sector that has a significant contribution. And the 20% to 25% figure is reflected as well globally and in many other countries, where usually the contribution of transport falls in and around that bracket of 20 to 25% of all greenhouse gas emission sources. So here in Ireland, there is a bit of feedback between policymakers and us energy systems modelers, and policymakers provide us with information on policy documents, the needs of the public, emissions targets, and modelling blind spots. And then on our side, then what we do here is we provide modelling tools, analytical capacity, and policy blind spots for policymakers so that they can improve and enhance their policy making and understand more about the decisions that they're making. So the purpose of this study is to look at what really happened when in 2008, Ireland switched from an engine CC-based tax on private vehicles in Ireland to one based on emissions. So you can see here on the left, the costing schemes for the engine CC-based tax, which tax people based on the size of their engine, to the ones based on an emissions band, okay? So, like, why would this ex post analysis of Ireland's 2008 car tax matter? Well, Today, 24 EU countries levy car taxes partially or totally based on the CO2 emissions or fuel consumption of a vehicle. So this analysis does have relevance for other EU countries that work on a similar car tax system. And this ex post analysis helps us reflect and improve our past policies. This policy is still in place and it has been updated slightly in 2021, but cars registered between 2008 and 2018 are still taxed under the same tax regime, and we really want to help understand the unintended consequences of the policy. Our energy systems modelling team, we like to focus on future policies, but then once policies are implemented, we can often forget to have a medium-term or longer-term look back on what decisions were made in the past and how they panned out to really pin down those unintended consequences. So next we'll move on to our methods. And we start off with using a technology stock model to understand what cars we have in the Irish car system. So we use the Irish car stock model, which was first developed by Daly and O'Gallagher, and it's a bottom-up technology stock model of cars in Ireland and has a list of cars by engine cc, fuel consumption, age and fuel type. And we get our sources from a number of different sources. So we would look at the Central Statistics Office here in Ireland and also look at odometer reading data from car testing centres. And we use these inputs to inform our calculations and develop our outputs, as with any good model. And you can see here on the left, we have information on distance travelled by cars, the emissions bands, the age or vintage of the cars, and so on. And we use this to calculate the emissions from the vehicles and also to calculate revenue for different scenarios that we set up. And from this, we can get annual CO2 emissions, the stock carbon intensity of the entire car fleet, and also we can look at the revenue gathered from different taxation schemes based on the car type. And I'd like to draw everyone's attention to this input, the on-road factor. So the on-road factor is a value which outlines the difference between the test values or the rated values which are used to charge the tax and the actual or on-road fuel consumption. And it's a factor to account for the growing difference between manufacturers' specified values under the new European driving cycle. So between 2008 and 2018, cars in Ireland were taxed using an emissions band based on NDEC, which is the new European driving cycle. And these emissions bands were manufacturer specified. However, they don't reflect on-road consumption. And when calculating actual emissions in real life, you have to add on this on-road factor. And the good news is cars registered after 2018 will have their emissions bands based on the new World Harmonized Light Vehicle Test, which is brought in specifically to reduce the need for an on-road factor and more accurately represent vehicle on-road performance in terms of fuel consumption. But we'll see now later that the on-road factor from the past 10 years means that many cars were in the wrong tax band, because when you think about it, cars on road were emitting a lot more than what manufacturers were saying, but they were still being taxed at the manufacturer specified value. And this is, I suppose, something that would always come in hindsight and really points out some of the finer details and potential problems and roadblocks to introducing such a technology heavy and metric specific policy. And now the WLTP utilizes a profile deemed to be more similar to the day-to-day usage than the previous NDEC standard. So you can see here from 2001 here and up to 2018 here, the on-road factor increases from a 10% difference between manufacturer specified value and on-road performance to up to a 40% difference. And this is based on values from the ICCT and also based on empirical data gathered from the household budget survey here in Ireland and also from odometer reading. We look at fuel spends in Ireland and we compare them to how far people are travelling here in Ireland from our car stock model. And we also had a look at new car sales from 2001 to 2018. And this scenario provides the basis for the factual scenario of the Irish car stock model, which uses new car sales proportions from 2001 to 2018 as inputs. And looking at EU-wide car sales, we see the proportion of new car sales in the EU by fuel type each year as we progress, as recorded by Eurostat. And now we set up our counterfactual scenario for what would have happened to car sales had the tax regime not been introduced. Because as you can see, prior to the introduction here in new car sales in Ireland, there is a significant development in purchasing trends in the post-2008 era. And the counterfactual scenario reflects the pre-2008 trends in purchasing patterns in Ireland relative to the EU. And over the period of 2001 to 2018, regressions of market trends between Ireland and the EU of car shares by fuel type and engine CC are examined. A simple regression analysis is adapted to project a counterfactual for the period of 2008 to 2018 with which to compare. So we complete our regression, we calculate projections of car sales by fuel type and engine CC for Irish-based cars based on EU-wide trends. Then we calculate the total car stock by applying new car sales and historical survival rates of cars greater than 1 year in age. And we adjust the relative distance travelled each year with respect to the behaviour of the factual scenario to ensure that the total passenger kilometre demand is serviced in the factual is the same as the counterfactual scenario. So that remains a constant. And here we see our counterfactual proportion of new car sales in Ireland by fuel type and engine size. And we also then look at fuel consumption, energy consumption, and emissions. And of course, our stock carbon intensity, which is defined as the grams of carbon dioxide emitted by each kilometre driven by the Irish private passenger transport fleet. And it considers the variation in distance travelled by cars of different ages, fuel types, and engine CCs. And it's calculated from the emissions over the total distance travelled. And we also have a look at annual motor tax revenue for our factual and our counterfactual scenarios. So the useful thing with the stock model is that we can calculate the revenue for each car based on the taxation rates from their engine CC value. And before 2008, all cars registered prior to 2008 in the stock are calculated using the engine CC rate. And after 2008, it's calculated using the emissions bands. And here are some of our results from our annual motor tax revenue calculations. First, we're going to look at the on-road factor scenario. And this scenario reflects what would have happened if cars under the new taxation regime were charged according to their on-road performance, as opposed to the manufacturer specified performance. And you can see the values here. So annual motor tax revenue would increase to over 1.2 billion by 2018. Next, we look at our counterfactual revenue, which looks at what would the revenue have been had the new taxation regime not been introduced, and we would have continued on with our typical trends in purchasing patterns by fuel type. And you would see here that the revenue would have been 1 billion by 2018. Next, we look at the recorded receipts, which is what we know the Department of Expenditure and Reform has actually gathered from this tax. And you can see here, it's at about 0.8 billion. And next is the actual revenue as calculated by the model. So we compare this against our recorded receipts so that we can best understand how well our car stock modelling tool is calculating recorded receipts and reflects the actual and real life car stock. Because of course, no model is perfect and we can only work with the data we have. And you can see here the revenue based on the simulation tool. There is a little bit of an error space there, but you can see perhaps the greatest insight from all of this is that the on-road factor and the difference between the manufacturer specified emissions bans and the actual on-road emissions ban means that there is perhaps a significant loss in revenue because it's reflecting manufacturer values that do not reflect what is actually happening with regard to fuel consumption and emissions ban taxes. And so our conclusions here are as follows. The 2008 car tax change influenced purchasing patterns. This change in purchasing patterns caused a slight shift in new car purchasing trends towards more efficient cars. And this is an insight from another paper by Rogan et al. And for 2018, we calculated that actual private car carbon dioxide emissions are calculated as 2.7% lower than the counterfactual no car tax change scenario case. However, as well, there is a cumulative emission savings over the period of 2008 to 2018 following the introduction of the car tax change, about 1.6 megatons of CO2 when compared to the counterfactual. And this really, in the context of passenger transport emissions, is certainly not enough to meet our intended targets. And the average stock carbon intensity of the fleet reduced from 189 grams of CO2 per kilometre in 2017 to 164 grams of CO2 in 2018. So we can see that behind all of this, there is an improvement in the efficiencies of fuel-powered cars. And the counterfactual scenario, which applied EU-wide trends to new sales in the Irish car stock, results in a carbon stock intensity of 168 grams of CO2 per kilometre in 2018. So we can see that the car tax policy was successful in increasing the efficiency of cars. And this does also include the on-road factors. So this is what's actually happening, going on in the fleet. There was an improvement in efficiency of the cars as a result of the car tax policy. We also know that recorded receipts from annual motor tax stood at 0.77 billion in 2018. However, the tax did ultimately result in a tax cut in disguise, as the emissions ban tax rates were lower overall than their engine CC counterparts. And so there was a significant cost associated with this tax measure and with this tax change. It was intended to be revenue neutral, but in fact, it was not. And it is estimated that motor tax receipts would have been 292 million euros higher in 2018 without the policy change. So that works out at a cost per ton of CO2 abated of greater than 600 euros, which would be considered high, if not very high. And this has been also corroborated by other studies using car choice algorithms also, where where a range was anticipated to be between 200 to 2,000 megatons of CO2 per megaton of CO2 avoided. Well, we know now this study also points to a value of about 600 euros per megaton of CO2 avoided. So what can we learn from this and help our policymakers for into the future? Well, what we gathered from this is perhaps an adjustable approach to car taxation policy would be a good idea. So every year in Ireland, there is a budget that is announced where tax changes and plans for the following year are made by the Irish government. And this could be helpful to manage fluctuations in tax take from the car tax. And it could make sense to adjust the car tax every year to make sure that the car tax does remain revenue neutral. Also, the gap between electric and low emission petrol diesel cars is still not great enough to incentivize a switch to EVs. Other EU states base vehicle taxes on power and weight, as well as emissions bans. And size is a problem also for Ireland, as the number of new vehicle sales for larger engine sizes is increasing. And this puts external constraints on parking and traffic, and also embedded CO2 from vehicle production. And this would be an area for future work. Also, in the context of all this, we know from the emissions calculations from our car stock model, absolute emissions from private vehicles rose over the period of 2008 to 2018. And really a multifaceted strategy is needed to enable deep decarbonization from the passenger transport sector. And this may involve moving beyond improving car efficiency to methods, and perhaps as well electrification, to methods such as modal shift and demand reduction, and the suite of policy measures that come along with that. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation. Questions and suggestions are welcome. And here are my contact details as well, if you ever wish to get in touch about this presentation. Thanks very much, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Vera. It's a very clear and very interesting presentation and a good work, and very intuitive. The results, it's not a very complicated, but the idea is very interesting, very useful for the energy policy, really. Does anybody wants to do any question, please? Come on. I think there are many interesting discussion.
I actually would love to jump in with that thought that you had there about it's quite a easy to understand analysis. It doesn't use any elaborate techniques, and I suppose the framing for that method was so that it could be helpful to policymakers, and that is a really big emphasis on the research that we do in the Energy Policy and Modelling Group. So it's really central to the approach that we have, that we can also share. So we currently are sharing the car stock model that was used in this analysis with the Department of Transport, and civil servants there can have a look at the figures and understand where the emissions are coming from. And that relationship between policymakers, perhaps who mightn't have the time or usually it's the time constraint is a big one, the time to dig into detailed cost optimization models, find stock modeling quite a useful tool to use in their analysis, and we can work with them to answer some of their burning policy questions. And this ex post analysis was one that I think threw up some really interesting thoughts on, particularly my favorite finding is on the revenue. So if the policy was intended to be revenue neutral, and this analysis shed some light on the reality that it wasn't, in fact, revenue neutral, and that cost results in a ramification that there is less income in the budget to spend on EV subsidies or other matters, or perhaps even more effective, better.
According with your results, maybe there is a gap. Maybe it could be more ambitious, the taxation, to introduce to reduce this gap with the cost of EV.
So one of our policy recommendations was to increase the relative difference between the different taxation bands, so that the benefit of purchasing an EV would be realized through that annual motor tax, because I'll just refer to, I'll share my screen here just for a minute, and I'll refer to this slide share. Here we go. So you can see here, like, the relative difference between the A0 band, which is where your EV would be, the 0, and the annual payment of 120 euros, between the next band and even the next band after that, where you would get, perhaps in this band, the 120, you'd get a lot of small petrol vehicles, and the difference, that relative difference, you know, I think it should be greater to really provide a tangible incentive. And I think that would be the next step now for this analysis, would be to understand that lever through the use of a cost choice model.
I can see that you love really to study that. You are implicated in this question very much. Any question No? Okay, thank you very much to all the speakers and to all the attendees. I think it has been a very interesting session. Maybe we are very tired now, but see you again, and very lucky for the publication in a good reviews, journals, all these works. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining this session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.